Welcome to the lecture on labor and forced labor. This online lecture is based on chapter 5.4 of the European Experience. In this lecture, I will give a brief overview of the history of labor and forced labor from approximately 1500 until today. Let's start with labor and forced labor in early modern history, approximately from 1500 to 1800. Any inquest into the role of pre-industrial labor may well begin with the reminder that the subject is neither as clear-cut nor as neatly distinguishable as it may appear. Labor used to refer primarily to agricultural work, especially physical toil, which constituted the mainstay of pre-industrial production. The emergence of proto-industry in the early modern period witnessed a gradual, if non-linear, shift in employment structures, which corresponds to a secular decline of the agricultural workforce. Analytically, labor covered a wide spectrum that ranged from free, voluntary wage labor to various forms of unfree labor determined by a combination of property rights and an individual's legal status. So let's talk about some occupational structures. The idea of a dualism between free and unfree labor is closely correlated to a number of assumed structural characteristics, such as the urban-rural divide and the socio-economic divergence between Eastern and Western Europe. Scholars continue to dispute and debate the driving force behind European economic development during the early modern period. Sure is that there were gradual, if non-linear, shifts in population and occupational structures, as well as labor productivity in both Eastern and Western Europe from the late Middle Ages through the early modern period. Despite increasingly organized warfare, demographic reconstructions indicate that Europe's population roughly doubled between 1500 and 1800. Europe's agricultural population grew less and averaged circa 35 to 39% during the same period. Recent reconstructions of economic output reveal strikingly similar patterns of low growth all across Europe. Most proto-industrial enterprises were typically concentrated outside urban centers and made use of all kinds of labor, that means free, partially free and/or unfree labor. Economic activity relied virtually exclusively on organic materials and traditional energy inputs. Hence, productivity gains were often the consequence of organizational modifications of societal command and control differentials, which manifested themselves differently, ranging from incentivized pressures to increased authority of the landowners. In short, as early modern Europe's output increased, its labor force also grew more regimented and disciplined. So let's talk about free wage labor in early modern period. Free labor refers to individuals and groups who sold their labor to the highest bidder in exchange for a daily, monthly, or annual wage. While free workers may refrain from engaging in any kind of labor, lack of savings and the need to sustain themselves served as primary incentives to enter the labor market. In a competitive labor market, wages received would be determined by one's marginal productivity. Therefore, at least in theory, the more productive a worker, the higher the wage the worker receives. Partially free labor, it refers to tenurial relations, subjection, and serfdom. Because while cities offered many opportunities to free labor, rural areas were typically characterized by various forms of partially free labor. Despite the decline of Europe's agricultural working population, the overwhelming majority of farmers and leaseholders tilled plots they did not own in their own name. Typically, ownership was concentrated in the hands of either the ecclesiastical or secular landlords, who could be either legal or natural persons. This system of property ownership revolved around the conjugation of payment in exchange for land use rights, and it is known as land tenure. Historically, the system can be traced back to the Middle Ages. It existed until the French Revolution west of Rhine, and east of the Rhine it continued well into the second half of the 19th century. Unfree labor refers to slavery, indentured servitude, convict, and conscription. So apart from these two analytical groups, the free and the partially free labor, there existed a third category in early modern Europe, which consisted of individuals or groups that neither could decide on the type of work they carried out nor enjoy freedom of movement. These were slaves, indentured servants, convicts, and conscripts. The institution of slavery is about as old as civilization itself, and it denotes people who were the personal property of their owners and could be bought, transferred, and sold at will. Under Roman law, a slave was defined as anyone who had either been captured in battle, been born to an enslaved mother, been sentenced to slavery as a criminal punishment, or who had sold themselves to redeem debt. Infidels, heretics, and pagans could also be enslaved. While many of these legal stances withered away over the course of the Middle Ages, indentured servants as well as convicts remained an important source of labor. The discovery of the Americas and the sea route to the Indian Ocean gave rise to European colonialism, which became a major driving force in the diffusion and growth of the triangular slave trade between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Between 1519 and 1867, around 12 to 13 million enslaved Africans were sold to Portuguese, British, French, Dutch, and Spanish merchants and forcibly relocated across the Atlantic. As elsewhere, slavery in the Americas was dreadful, with the overwhelming majority of enslaved people ending up on Caribbean and South American plantations and mines owned by Western European proprietors and investors. Especially from the mid-17th century onwards, slaves were used to produce export commodities to be consumed by high-earning wage laborers in northwestern Europe. So let's move on with labor in modern history, circa from 1800 to 1900. 19th century Europe witnessed changes in the character and organization of labor. The secondary sector of production and manufacturing, in contrast to the primary agricultural sector and the tertiary sector of services, expanded as more and more countries embarked on industrialization. While for most of human history the majority of people's livelihoods had been based on their own means of production, working for wages became the norm as industrialization progressed. This increasing dependence on wages birthed the development of labor movements, which had the goal of protecting the wage laborer against mistreatment by their capitalist employer. Modern Europe relied heavily on unfree and semi-free labor in the form of slavery and coolie labor, but mostly outside the borders of Europe itself, in the countries it had colonized. Although semi-free labor also existed within Europe in the form of serfdom, most labor within Europe was considered free, although the extent to which factory laborers actually enjoyed freedom can be debated. So, before we move on to industrial work, let's talk about agriculture. Before we will have a closer look at the changes in the secondary sector, it is worth to mention some shifts in the agricultural sector. During the 19th century, the European agricultural sector underwent drastic changes in labor organization, technology, and output. Between the 17th and the 19th century, the agricultural revolution took place in Britain, with increasing agricultural output and rapid population growth as a result. Many historians believe that this agricultural revolution paved the way for the Industrial Revolution because it freed up labor due to rising productivity per farmer. Because of these changes, the relative share of the total labor force working in the agricultural sector significantly decreased in 19th century Europe. The rapidly expanding industrial and service sectors absorbed large chunks of the agricultural labor force, and this decline in agricultural employment was made possible by the aforementioned increases in agricultural productivity. Also, the medieval institution of serfdom, which tied agricultural laborers to the land on which they worked in exchange for protection, was gradually abolished in Western and Central Europe during the early modern era, and many countries officially abolished this practice during the period of the French Revolution. Conversely, in some Eastern European countries, serfdom persisted for much longer. The Industrial Revolution and the social question. As mentioned above, the Industrial Revolution, which started in Britain halfway through the 18th century, instigated important economic and social changes in 19th century Europe. Although the timing, causes, and even the term Industrial Revolution itself are heavily contested, it is accepted that all over Europe, albeit at different moments in time and in varying ways, economies and populations were affected by rapidly changing production techniques propelled by technological innovation. During the first stages of industrialization, the share of employment in manufacturing expanded while the relative agricultural labor force shrank. During later stages of industrialization, the service sector gained in importance as well. Intensifying bureaucratization boosted the demand for white-collar workers, such as secretaries, which opened up new jobs for women. Moreover, improved methods of communication, including railroads and the telegraph, created new possibilities for the global movement of people, products, and ideas, which likewise expanded work in the service sector. These economic changes also had major consequences for the way in which labor was organized. An increasing number of laborers became dependent on wage labor as opposed to their own means of production. With the spread of the factory system, the production processes became more specialized and formalized. One worker became responsible for only one specific part of the production progress, a system which significantly lowered the costs of labor. Even though most European economies grew significantly as a result of their growing manufacturing sectors, there were serious downsides of these developments. As a result of rapid urbanization and population growth, living conditions in exploding factory cities, such as the English textile city of Manchester, were very poor. In Manchester, the small houses which sheltered the new industrial workers were built closely together and lacked proper sanitation systems or clean drinking water. The working conditions in factories were equally bad, with unhygienic working environments and insufficient regard for worker safety. Moreover, poverty and unemployment were widespread. This came to be seen more and more as a problem to be solved, referred to as the social question. Protective legislation was one of the ways in which some governments tried to improve the living standards of the working class in the aftermath. But not only that, labor movements formed in the early modern period. The laboring class did not stand idle in the face of the fundamental processes of structural change, industrialization, urbanization, and the social question. Although labor movements have a very long tradition, and activities like strikes had been long practiced during the 19th century, labor unions emerged all over Europe. These unions eventually developed into strong organizations with mass membership and economic, political, and social influence. Throughout the 19th century, different actors participated in the process of improving the situation of the working classes and in finding answers to the social question. Some nation-states began with legal regulations, elements of the middle class advocated for more humane conditions, employers offered paternalistic support, and the workers organized themselves to stand up for their own interests. The ideological groundings of the labor movements were shaped by intellectuals as well as laborers. In France and Germany, so-called craft socialism became very prominent, promoting the idea that a just and equal society could be crafted. Likewise, the demands of the democratic Chartist movement in England, which aimed to give the laboring class a political voice by pleading for universal suffrage, at least for men, were formulated and carried by skilled workers. To achieve their aims, the labor movement possessed a great variety of practices and actions. Ludism, as a direct form of violence, disappeared in the first half of the 19th century due to more effective forms of protest and more durable and powerful organizations. Instead, strikes became a powerful weapon ranging from small-scale events on the shop floor to nationwide mass strikes. In the organization of these strikes, trade unions played an important role, although they sometimes shied back from using this weapon where futile strikes could imperil their organizations. Besides striking and forming trade unions, political engagement and political associations came to the fore. Although political labor parties faced state persecution throughout Europe, their success in many countries demonstrated that persecution was not the answer to this political societal rise of the laboring class. In addition, mutual help and insurance fostered solidarity among the workers and was an important starting point for national insurance schemes against the risk of illness, unemployment, work accidents, and old age, beginning from the late 19th century. Finally, international cooperation strengthened the power of the labor movements and demonstrated the importance of transnational networking. But this ideal of transnational cooperation would ultimately collapse in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I was not foreseeable in the 19th century. Despite their success, labor movements contained unsolved problems. Firstly, because the labor unions and parties had their origin in craft traditions and associational organization patterns, they mainly represented skilled workers. In striving for respectability, the Lumpenproletariat, in quotes, as the lowest societal strata had been called by Marx and Engels, was excluded. Secondly, a conscious sense for the suppressed in colonial peripheries only partially developed, and many labor movement leaders believed in a European imperial civilizing mission. Nonetheless, there was criticism of colonial regimes and slavery put forward by the labor movements. Finally, labor movements were shaped by male behavior and membership. It took a long fight for female workers to be accepted as comrades on equal terms and not as rivals on the labor market. The level of political power achieved by the working class remained limited. In Great Britain, the cooperation between liberals and labor helped that trade unionists entered parliament. In France, individual socialist politicians only briefly participated in bourgeois government. In Germany, with the biggest labor movements in Europe, working class organizations were strong, but due to the political system only had limited influence. In Russia, socialists continued to be persecuted. At the same time, throughout the 19th century, an integration process occurred in which labor movements became much more closely attached to their nation states, gained influence on the municipal level, and helped to improve the economic social situation of the working class. So, the last part of this lecture is labor and forced labor in contemporary history, approximately from 1900 to 2000. Through the 20th century and early 21st century, change in patterns of work and labor in Europe occurred on a tremendous scale. At the beginning of this period, in most of the European states, the majority of people still worked in agriculture. By 2020, in the countries of the Eurozone, only 3% of the employed labor force worked in agriculture, but 74% in the service-orientated tertiary sector. Work in industry declined, as did physical and manual work more generally. In this respect, the characterization of the Global South as workhouse for the West has a lot of truth. However, one should bear in mind exceptions to the rule, such as, for example, the fact that in Europe in 2018, 65 million people still worked in the automobile industry, with many still performing work on the shop level. Besides these socio-economic changes, further developments reshaped practices of labor in Europe. The male breadwinner model was contested, and the proportion of female workers in the labor force rose. However, this trend did not follow the same pattern everywhere, with significant national divergence after 1945. In Western Europe, France and Germany stand for different paths in female employment. In Eastern Europe, to a much higher degree, female labor was part of the system. So let's talk again about free and unfree labor in contemporary history. The First and Second World Wars combined ended about 60 million lives in Europe. Over this period, technological research was oriented towards the goal of building up military advantage, consequently brought production, processing, transport, storage to much more sophisticated levels. The introduction of supply chains increased both output and quality in practically all fields of the economy. This statement is true for the capitalist areas of Europe, but the Soviet bloc was also inspired and fascinated by the Fordist production regime. In the eastern half of Europe, in countries under Soviet influence, the average citizen also gained new experiences of work during the decades of socialism. Through nationalization and collectivization, the state became the main employer. In the rhetoric of these regimes, this put an end to exploitation, and as a result, the workers' attitude to work also changed. Work became a moral duty and the source of self-pride. The planned economy achieved full employment. However, if someone did not want to work under the socialist system, it was a criminal offense. In socialism, more women took up places in the workforce than ever before. The female tractor driver became a symbol of the modern socialist woman. Conversely, the woman who ran her household and raised her children became a symbol of an anachronism. From the late 1940s, large masses of women were undertaking paid work not only in the socialist industry but also in the collectivized agriculture. Following the great migrations which took place after 1945 within Europe, it is worth noting the beginning of post-colonial migration. The collapse of colonial regimes outside Europe triggered a massive flow of immigrants who started to change the community models in most Western European countries. In most cases, the newcomers were given the opportunity to find employment only in the low-paid sectors of the economy. Since the mid-1970s, finding lower-cost countries for labor became a prime target for many European companies, and this cost-cutting strategy became a vital element of industrial competitiveness. These processes led to the deindustrialization of the West from at least the second half of the 1970s and accelerated in the fully globalized economies at the end of the 20th century. These meant simple closing down sites production, typical factories, in one part of Europe and moving it to either within the enlarged EU to countries with lower wages or beyond, such as Turkey, Morocco, China or Indonesia. The automotive industry is an illustrative example, with many automotive factories closed in France and Belgium and reopened in the Czech Republic, Romania and beyond. It took the decision makers around 50 years to realize that by offshoring production and reaching the target of lower labor costs, they are undercutting the economy in their own markets. The reason for this phenomenon is that those who have been made redundant due to the shutdown of their workplace may not so easily acquire new skills and find an alternative source of income. So now let's talk about involuntarily non-work and the welfare state. Depending on wage work means that periods of non-work in which one does not earn money can develop into an existential crisis. Hence, the welfare state is considered here understood with regard to risks of non-work. Aspects of the welfare states relating to housing, distribution, education and tax policies are set aside. The risks which could cause one to fall into the existential crisis of non-work are omnipresent. However, how these risks were perceived and how one tried to avoid their negative consequences changed over time. Due to economic cycles, unemployment varies across time and space. In a broader perspective, we can define 4 phases of unemployment patterns. From the late 19th century to the First World War, unemployment rates were relatively low and cyclic variations were moderate. This changed after 1918 and shot upward in the years of the Great Depression. After the Second World War, development was different. For about 20 years, most Western European states faced an economic boom with very low unemployment rates. Since the 1970s, with the oil price shock, overproduction and economic change, unemployment again increased. Further increases hit after 1990 in the Eastern European states, where unemployment before was previously low or hidden, and the amplitudes of the economic cycle were higher than at the beginning of the 20th century. Especially since the 1950s, the extension of social insurance is impressive. Coverage rates rose, benefits became better and higher. But the insurance of involuntarily non-work time is not a permanent success. Already in the late 1970s, with changes in political economy, the buzzword here is neoliberalism, political and social forces tried to roll back the social insurance system. The end of the Cold War after 1990 reinforced this trend. The years after the financial crisis 2008 and throughout the corona pandemic in 2020 and 2021 demonstrated the need for a strong welfare state. Short-term compensation prevented mass unemployment. In 2020, in total, 33 out of 36 OECD countries used this labor market policy instrument during the corona crisis, securing and improving the welfare state to protect people in times without paid work should be a European aim for the future. So let's talk about workers' struggles for and against work. In the workers' movement in the 20th century, an observer can see several patterns as the movements fought to either reform or revolution. As discussed in the previous paragraphs, labor movements, both unionized and not, successfully managed, depending on economic cycles, put pressure on owners and the state in order to soften the most flagrant conditions of precarity, winning, for example, such reforms as health or social insurance. During the Cold War, the labor movements managed to effectively harness the fears of the Western states during the East-West conflict in order to create and maintain models of welfare states that guaranteed steady wage growth and thus the overall bettering of workers' conditions, at least during the 30 years after the Second World War. Nevertheless, after the 1973 oil crisis, a new political economy started to dominate in the West with radical liberalism that eventually broke both the welfare state and the labor movements. The results of this new ideological input were the destruction of the centralized workplace by a fragmentation of the production cycle and the extensive use of subcontracting. The process of dismantling the welfare state in Europe was accelerated by the fall of the Soviet bloc in the early 1990s and the enlargement of the European Union with countries that had transformed their economies by neoliberal shock therapy. In the 20th century, we also witnessed some changing in the working class cultures. So, as a hybrid form between the elite and folk culture, popular culture started to emerge with an important element of consumerism to which workers were attracted in the period of economic growth. Generally, during the 20th century, one can also observe the convergence of workers' culture with that of the middle classes. Cultural changes among workers can be observed differentially according to the generational divisions as well as the geographical ones, with the Western and Northern Europe on one side and Eastern and Southern Europe on the other. The evolution of working class culture in the second half of the 20th century was due to the increased share of university students from the working class environment, particularly from the mid-1960s onwards. This phenomenon was shared in most European countries, and it found its expression in particular in the movements active in the turmoil of the long 1968 in France, Germany, Italy, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. In the following 2 decades, the close cooperation and connection between students and workers' movements followed in other European countries, such as in the Athens Polytechnic Uprising in November 1973. What young workers shared with students as an emphasis on culture as a political expression. This focus manifested itself in different individualized but collectively celebrated lifestyles, particularly related with protest and rock music. Different fractions of workers, nevertheless, were not that enthusiastic about cooperating with academics, which was also due to their different roles in other contexts, such as work. So let me get to some conclusions about labor and forced labor. To summarize, let me conclude on some central insights from the different time periods regarding labor and forced labor in European history. For the most part, the seemingly clear-cut distinction between free and unfree labor obscures the fact that the distinction is in fact one of degree rather than kind. Furthermore, all these categories were found all over early modern Europe. Research since the 1960s has shown that early modern Europe economic development, as in most contemporary developing countries, hinged on the intensification of labor, adapted to local and regional circumstances and typically supported by state power. Pre-industrial landowners and merchant capitalists invested in productive capabilities ranging from agricultural improvements to proto-industrial ventures to integration into long-distance trade. These dynamics were highly variated and geographically diffuse. Hence, rather than dividing Europe between, for example, free and unfree, it is more helpful to think about economically active hotspots, both rural and urban, embedded within distinctly pre-modern social relations that persisted well into the 19th century. Work in the 20th century did not lose its multifaceted nature. Especially in the first half of the century, devastating facets of work can be observed in Europe in very different forms. Alienated work in Fordism, forced labor in camps, involuntary non-work as mass employment. The second half of the 20th century lightens the perspective in some ways with a powerful and vital welfare state, strong unions guaranteeing better working conditions, and a decline in forced labor. On the other hand, there were new, onerous changes. Low-paid jobs, which do not guarantee one's living, kept many in precarity, a declining, but still ongoing unequal gender pay gap, the insecurity of jobs in a period of growing automation and artificial intelligence, and the exploitation of work and workers in the global south to secure lifestyle and consumption in Europe.